Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for our weekly Hanauma Talk seminar series presented by the Hawaii Sea Grants Hanauma Bay Education Program. My name is Gavin Ujay, and I am the Outreach Program Coordinator for the Education Program. For the month of March, we are hosting the City and County of Honolulu's Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency. And I would like to introduce Matt Gonser, who is the Chief Resilience Officer and Executive Director, and he'll be introducing himself as well as another speaker tonight. Before Matt does that though, I would just like to just kind of mention a few housekeeping rules to please keep your microphone off as well as your video function during the presentation. If you guys do have any questions, please try to keep it till the end of the talk where we have a small little question and answer period, or feel free to type it in the chat box to the side, and hopefully we'll get to it or address it at the end of the talk. With that, Matt, would you talk a little bit about your program as well as introduce our other speaker for tonight?
Sure, thanks Gavin. Aloha everybody, happy to be with you this evening. As Gavin mentioned, my name is Matt Gonser and I'm the Executive Director and City's Chief Resilience Officer, and I lead the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency, a new role I started just at the start of this calendar year with the new administration. I've been with the office since October of 2017 and have a long love for the Sea Grant College program, where I worked for just about 6 years prior to joining the city. And I'm joined this evening by Ujay Siddharth, who is a climate research adaptation analyst with our office and serves with the city and volunteers as an AmeriCorps VISTA. We'll be sharing some of the presentation tonight with you all. And what we intend to do is just to give you a very quick background on the office, but primarily dig into a specific project. And then Ujay will follow up with some of the additional research and data collection and community engagement that we intend to embark on to support the prioritization and the implementation around one of the main climate hazards that we'll be sharing with you tonight. So with that, I'm gonna kick us off just to share a little bit about the office. So hopefully, if you're a resident of this island, you may have remembered that in 2016, the voters were offered the opportunity to create the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency. And overwhelmingly, at that point in time, the voters said, yes, we have seen the changes out in community, we understand the science, and we believe we need some additional focus and dedicated resources to support the change that is coming to our shoreline. So, the mission is big and broad, but simply we need to make sure that the city is walking the talk in terms of our own operations and investments, making sure that we are reducing and ultimately eliminating our contributions to global climate change. And then as much as we can, work up and down the different levels of government. We're very excited about the renewed federal leadership and opportunities coming out already and over the horizon. And then lastly, just wanted to key in that at the same time the office was created, a new official city commission was created, the city's Climate Change Commission. And, big broad title to our office, Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency. And resilience itself can be kind of a heady academic topic. But what we're really trying to talk about is, our ability as residents of this island, as neighbors, as family, as institutions and government, how can we survive, adapt, and thrive no matter what kinds of shocks and stresses we may experience. And with this information, we very early on went out into community and we're talking about climate change challenges, the issues of the 21st century. And long story short, what I really just wanted to highlight is a lot of the work, and as Gavin mentioned, we'll be joining you all and the future viewers throughout the month of March to share different segments and components of the Resilience Office's work. In addition to the resilience strategy and some of the real specific guiding policy objectives and projects that were identified last year, towards the end of last year, there was a new ordinance that was passed. And this further codified our programmatic work as well as specific policies and projects that we'll be sharing with the participants throughout the remainder of the month. And what Ujay and I are here to engage with you all tonight is one of those specific policies around climate change adaptation and an initiative that was sketched up and conceived of in the resilience strategy process called Climate Ready Oahu. So how do we prepare Oahu's communities for the impacts of climate change? But also not just really prepare ourselves for the worst, but find these opportunities to enhance community and environmental conditions as change is coming to those communities. And what is climate change? Very simplistically, we know that we have this nice blanket around the Earth that has enabled us to evolve and develop into life as we know it, but we ourselves are adding more and more threads to this blanket, and that blanket is getting thicker and thicker and thicker and trapping more and more heat within the atmosphere. And the direct cause and direct driver of climate change are human greenhouse gas emissions. And the foundational science for this is measured here within the state atop Mauna Loa. As you can see, this famous Keeling curve showing the dramatic increase in our more contemporary times. Though we are not going to talk more about the need to eliminate our emissions tonight, I wanted to key you in on that the city does have a draft first ever climate action plan, and that actually is the theme of next week's talk. So I strongly encourage you tune back in for What the Cap? Climate action to meet our carbon pollution elimination goals. But coming back to climate change, these things are measurable, and we have data and science and observations all around this state showing things like increasing sea level rise or increasing temperatures or changes in rainfall patterns. And it's the changes that then have impacts either to our ecosystems, our human systems, our infrastructure systems, and these impacts can have consequences. So what we're trying to do is, one, acknowledge and recognize the changes, but then take the appropriate actions commensurate with those changes to prepare ourselves and adapt to a future condition. An example is a decrease in trade wind days as measured from the early 1970s through present, or we have a real long time series information at the Honolulu Harbor tide gauge and the understanding of the concerns of sea level rise into the future. Similarly, we've measured at least 1 degree of Fahrenheit increase locally, though that is different all around the state, and actually the rate of increase is higher at higher elevations. And the reason we are acutely aware of all of these issues is because of all the kinds of research that has been going on for decades locally, but also because of this Climate Change Commission. So these are 5 experts in the fields of climate sciences and the built environment, and they are responsible for providing the city with the most localized information around climate change and concerns, as well as impacts and recommendations on ways that we can address them. So in 2018, they produced their 2 first guidance documents. These are foundational pieces of information, a climate change brief, which gives us these different thematic areas and what has been measured, what we're experiencing today, and what's likely to come into the future. And then they additionally provided guidance around sea level rise and different benchmarks to consider into the future. And in no short order, really just a month after the Climate Change Commission delivered this information, the mayor at the time, Mayor Caldwell, issued an executive order for all city agencies to incorporate the information from that climate change brief and sea level rise guidance and incorporate it into our work. And one example of it is how we then tried to translate all of the different climate science that's out there into one web viewer, which is called the Climate Ready Oahu Web Explorer, which you can see there or access via our website, because it can sometimes be challenging to sort of understand spatially where some of these things may be of concern. So we would encourage your viewing of that web tool at your leisure. Shown here are different sea level rise hazard information along the Ewa Beach shoreline. And then following up a couple years later, as we were learning more and more about increasing temperatures and some of the decline of our community forest around Oahu, another mayoral directive was issued to address increasing temperatures and the urban canopy. And Ujay will be talking more about heat data that we have collected, heat data that we're going out to collect, and some of the concerns we have around disparate impacts for people all around this island. But what we're really trying to stave off is risk into the future, right? So we know that plans or policies present opportunities or even community expectations, but really the environment that we have planned for to date isn't the environment that we need to prepare for into the future. So how do we incorporate new information into decision-making processes so that we can better understand the kinds of obligations that we might be putting on future generations, or to try to stave off and not accumulate more and more risk into the future. And these are the kinds of decision making that households do on a daily basis, and that government also needs to think about, as we have an obligation to protect community, protect resources, and protect ecosystems into the future. And we need to have that long-term outlook to consider the kinds of decisions that we're making today. So as a quick snapshot of what the Climate Ready Oahu project is, we've been working on this probably since about July or August of last year, with some of the community engagement ramping up September into October. This is the current project timeline, though it is potentially going to be affected as we look to bring more resources to this really critical discussion. But generally and oversimplified, what we're trying to do is twofold: understand our vulnerabilities and the climate risks, and then take the steps to address those risks. So as part of that risk assessment, we look at understanding exposure, both to people and assets all around the island. We analyze and evaluate those risks. We look at the economic concerns of action or inaction, and we're trying to bring this information as a supporting resource into the community planning processes all around this island. And then as we progress, we look at the adaptation actions to actually address any of those climate hazards that we identify, and we'll talk about those, and not just think about siloed approaches, but really understand the opportunities for agencies, community partners, working across state and city government to think about these cross-cutting opportunities, because we know no one can really do it all alone, and there's different jurisdictional things that are realities, but they shouldn't be hurdles to addressing the challenges. And then lastly, towards the end, how do we make sure that our decision making is aligned with the information that's coming out of a project like this? And that kind of the tools of looking at the hazard mitigation plan, the community plans around this island, and also understanding opportunities to align our budget with the information that's coming out of this process. So, a lot of people will say, show me your budget and I'll show you your values. And that's what we want to make sure. We want to make sure that we're taking the climate risk information and making risk-informed decisions moving forward. So what we've done to date, we're actually well into the community engagement process, and we hope you've either had an opportunity to, at your leisure, participate in some of the online surveys, or perhaps you've joined us for one of the meetings. At the different phases, we're really asking these key questions. And rounds 1 and 2, we're in this first phase of what are the consequences of a changing climate. At that point in time, we looked at the climate changes and local action. We got people's gut take on some of their concerns about things that have impacted them today, but also concerns towards mid-century. And then how do we think about some guiding principles to support, the values-based decision-making that we hope still is consistent with community sentiment and community appetite for change. And then still within that first phase, we then went into round 2 to better understand the climate hazards themselves and the exposure around the island, and then start to identify some potential adaptation action areas, which are not to prioritize adaptation in any location per se, but just to identify some geographies that could help us think through the case examples of adaptation on the ground. And then most recently, at the start of this year, we dug deeper into those adaptation action areas to think about potential strategies and ways to approach the climate hazards. And then we furthered the discussion around a climate resilience and equity screen so that we are better understanding the concerns about disparate impacts around the island and making sure that we're asking the appropriate questions to potentially prioritize implementation of any of the actions to better support communities that perhaps need the most support. As an overview and a general snapshot, the final climate risk assessment, based on both existing literature, hazard data information, the community input, the public meetings, as well as our community advisory meetings, and city department interviews, these climate hazards were identified as the ones that were of most concern to either community members, environment in a location, or people in a place, or the economy for the island as a whole, but also for city agencies when they were considering our own assets, our infrastructure, and the services that we provide to community all around the island. So at that point in time, in the early phases of the project, they keyed in on sea level rise and coastal erosion, increasing temperature, heavy rain events or rain bombs, also a decrease in precipitation, and hurricanes, which we know are a multi-hazard event, including storm surge, high winds, and heavy rainfalls. And what you see on the bottom right is this matrix of understanding that risk is really, it's influenced by likelihood and consequence. So the different hazards, we have different levels of confidence in how likely a specific scenario or threshold is. We have very high confidence in things like sea level rise and increasing temperatures. And there's just more variability in terms of the reality of a rain bomb or the reality of a hurricane track coming across this island. But we do know that something like a hurricane is going to have very major to catastrophic consequences, but it ranks lower simply because the likelihood relative to sea level rise or increasing temperatures is just lower. But in essence, this really helps us really key in on areas and opportunities to address these problems moving forward. And that's what we did in the round 2 community discussions, where we were asking people to consider these hazards and help us think about adaptation action areas. We were asking them around concerns, areas of top concern for any of the hazards generally, but then also what are specific concerns to impacts to people in a place, impacts to the environment of that place, and impacts to the economy of the island as a whole. And in total, you see these 5 geographies that are the areas that we will be looking into in further detail as the project progresses. So, clumping some of those hazards, we're really looking at how do we become sea level wise, make sure that we're doing all that we can to get flood ready, and taking necessary steps today to beat the heat into the future. Because we know that these climate changes and these impacts are going to have consequences for us, and we need to be proactive and take some early steps to either support community change today or to prepare for the kinds of environments or mitigate the kinds of environments that might be coming 10, 20, 30 years into the future. And again, we know that those consequences are not necessarily going to be borne equally all around the island. So we are further looking at what are new equity or climate practices that we need to consider in implementation of any of these strategies. And this is actually another plug for one of the seminars coming up later in the month. On Thursday, March 18th, our colleagues Lala Nuss and Anna Minnis will be joining you all to talk about the nexus of equity and climate resilience. And they'll be able to share more information as to how we are implementing some of these awarenesses and data into our decision-making moving forward. So it's both a people discussion, but also thinking about the internal city operations. We know that there's just a whole suite of other activities and plans, whether the infrastructure agencies have their functional plans, we, the city, also have a long-term capital budget, right? How do we make sure that the decisions that are being made for these facilities, for these resources and investments are considering the best available science around climate change hazard and really risk reduction? Again, not just preparing ourselves for the worst, but being proactive about finding ways to improve upon community conditions into the future. So with that, this is an example of the most recent community meeting that we had in early January, where we are looking in and focusing in on equity and executing city policy. We're learning from other jurisdictions how they are progressing with different tools, oftentimes called screens, where it's a series or suite of questions that help gut check where you are in your planning processes, but also make transparent the thought processes on implementing any decision along the way. So this is mostly just to represent that this is iterative and in process at this point in time. Our office, through the Climate Ready Oahu project, has collected a lot of great feedback from the intro survey, as well as the consequence rating scale and the adaptation action area discussions. The city itself, we've had various initiatives throughout the COVID pandemic where we were connecting with community and just having very frank and open discussions about where they were at that point in time, but also some of the stresses that magnified the consequences of COVID. There's additional city council resolutions. We ourselves at the Resilience Office have a climate resilience and equity program, which will be coming up in a couple of weeks. Then, as I mentioned, we were looking at some of the other municipal examples. And I'm pleased to now actually hand it off to Ujay Siddharth, who will talk about this concept of equity and thinking about implementation practices, or better understanding the potential concerns about disparate impacts all around the island, specifically focusing in on increasing temperatures and that as one of our key climate hazards of concern. So Ujay, take us away.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you everybody for joining. So in the first portion of this presentation, you guys heard Matt Gonser outline climate adaptation strategy, Climate Ready Oahu. How are we addressing the various climate hazards our island will be facing over the next years, decades, over the next century? And so in the next portion of this presentation, I want to focus specifically on the work our office is doing around one of those specific hazards, which is increasing temperatures and rising temperatures. And so before I delve into the work, I thought I'd paint a picture of where we are as an island, as a state, where we are as a planet in terms of rising temperatures. And so, if we look back on the decade of the 2010s, the 2010s was the Earth's hottest decade on record. 2016 specifically was the hottest year ever recorded for the planet. Statewide, if we look at Hawaii, average air temperature has increased by 0.76 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 100 years, and 2015 and 2016 were the warmest years on record. During the strong El Nino of 2015, Honolulu set or tied 11 days of record heat. 2019 specifically was a year of record temperatures globally and locally. And 2019 was the hottest year ever recorded for the planet. And if we look locally here as well, in 2019, 273 daily temperature records were tied or broken statewide in Hawaii, and 135 of those were new records. And so from here, you can get a perspective of where we are as a planet. Temperatures are continuing to rise, and we're only going to see more and more impacts to our communities as we face higher heat and heat waves. Next slide, please.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ujay. I wanted to caveat, as it relates to next week's discussion, you can see here, one of the things that we're better understanding is that we actually do have the ability to bend the curve on temperature in particular. And that's why talking about both sides of the climate security coin, climate adaptation and climate action, which is eliminating carbon pollution, need to be had hand in hand. So I would encourage everyone to tune back in next week, where we'll talk about the climate action plan.
Thank you. Yeah, so, and one of the reasons why I was, talking about 2019 was a big year. 2019 was also the year we went out and conducted the Oahu Heat Mapping campaign. We went out on August 31st, which happened to be another record day for Honolulu and marked the hottest day of the year for our island, and also tied Honolulu's hottest ever recorded temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So with the help of volunteers, 10 pairs of volunteers, we completed the one-day community heat assessment, drove along 1-hour routes at 6 a.m. in the morning, 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and 7 p.m. in the evening. And you can see on the right there, one of the routes right up through Mililani and Wahiawa, where you can see where one pair of volunteers drove to collect information. And so they had automatic sensors attached to their cars. These were provided at no cost to the city, and they were attached to the vehicles to capture temperature, humidity, and GPS locations along each route. Next slide, please. And as a result of that data collection, the consultant returned to us with the Oahu Heat Map. This is publicly accessible at bit.ly/Oahu Heat Map. You can go there yourself easily. You can navigate to your neighborhood of interest and see what the temperature was like on that specific day. And you can even input your home address. There's an address bar in which you can put in your home location to see what the temperature is like close to your home, to get a perspective of what are the temperatures you're experiencing during the summers here in Honolulu, here on Oahu. Next slide, please. And so after we received the data, we hosted it online publicly for everybody to see. We then began to think about what can we do with this data. How can we conduct very initial preliminary analyses that give us some perspective on what heat is like on our island. And so here are the top 5 hottest locations on Oahu. You can see that the absolute maximum heat index recorded was 107.3 degrees at the Waimalu Plaza Shopping Center. Other locations here include Waimanalo along the Kalanianaole Highway, Ala Moana Boulevard next to Ala Moana Mall, Kalanianaole Highway again in Kahala, and then Kealaho Street right next to Sandy Beach. And so, these among other locations across the island, we could identify, these are priority locations, they're extremely hot. And so the next question we asked, right, is, what are the conditions that make these locations so hot? A preliminary look at the data showed that many of the hottest locations had one thing in common. There are high concentrations of impervious surfaces, such as concrete and asphalt, and low tree canopy cover. And data in many of these locations, with high concentrations of paved surfaces, also increased by as much as 28 degrees from morning to afternoon. So this means that over the course of the day, from morning to afternoon, these locations absorbed and retained heat at a very high rate. In contrast, locations with more tree cover or in grassy parks experienced only up to 8-degree increases, in heat index over that same period of time. So that was some of the analysis that we conducted. And here next on this slide, you can see the Oahu Heat Vulnerability Map Series. And we'll take some time to take you through the map series itself and show you some of the tools that are available for you to look at your neighborhood, or just get a sense of how heat is impacting your community. Okay, and Matt, it will help us navigate. Thank you for doing that, Matt. So in this first tab here, if you scroll all the way down to tool 1, this tool really allows you to look at land use patterns and how land use really affects temperature and heat. And so if you zoom in to specific neighborhoods and zoom into Kapiolani Park, you can use the spyglass to see what is the underlying land cover, what is the underlying land use and landscaping patterns under specific temperatures. So in Kapiolani Park, you can see it's a big green open space, temperatures are low. And then you go kind of across the way to Kaimuki, which is a residential area, very little tree cover, very little green space. And you can see that through the spyglass. You can see the differences in the landscaping and the land use patterns and the effect that can have on temperature. So this is just one example, and you can visit this site and use this tool as a resource to check out your own neighborhood as well. Aulawai Golf Course, as well as a big open green space, and how that can really demonstrate a decrease in temperatures. So thanks for that. The second tool I wanted to show, and this really illustrates, the comparison between heat and social vulnerability. In 2018, we went and, collected some information and used variables to construct the social vulnerability index for Oahu. And so if you scroll down to I think the second tab, this one here, it shows the heat data and the social vulnerability index data side by side. So you can see, which are the communities that rank highly in terms of vulnerability, and do these communities face heat stress levels that we should be concerned about. And Kalihi is a good example to sometimes look at because it's a source of high social vulnerability, and you can see that there are some temperature considerations there as well. So, perhaps targeted areas for intervention when thinking about cooling and greening infrastructure strategies. Thank you for that. And the next tool I want to show was in heat adaptation strategies, looking at cooling through trees. And if you scroll down a little bit to the next section, this shows the distribution of urban tree canopy, the distribution of parks, and this is one strategy very key to city intervention is planting trees and maintaining our green spaces. So where are the places we can intervene in terms of increasing our tree canopy cover and increasing green space? And then the section after this one here allows us, we mapped out the neighborhood resources that are available to communities in the event of a heat-related emergency. So, it's important to know where your community health centers are. It's important to know where your hospitals are. And another, resource that's underutilized are free and public cooling centers, such as libraries, which you can go to in the case of a heat wave and don't have to pay. You can just go and enter, and they're always air conditioned. So, just wanted to, point towards this as a resource based on the data that we collected on that one day in 2019, the Oahu Heat Mapping campaign, all of the different ways you can interpret it to really think about action intervention that can benefit local Oahu communities. This is a resource available to you all, available to everybody at bit.ly/Oahu Heat Vulnerability. Thanks for navigating us through that, Matt. So moving forward, what are our next steps? Now that we have data at the island-wide scale, we're pursuing data collection at an extremely localized scale now. Key questions we're asking is, in which places do we need to change the landscape environment to cool down the on-the-ground lived temperature experience? And so we've procured these sensors, these data loggers, and you can see them here, where you can attach them to utility poles, to trees in parks. You can attach them to bus stops to really track the surrounding temperature and humidity in a specific location. And so by comparing, we have 8 sensors in total. So for example, putting 4 sensors and a grassy and area with a lot of tree canopy, and then nearby an area with high impervious surface with no tree canopy cover at all, we can really identify, okay, what is the temperature differential here? And, what are the opportunities for intervention? Is this area really experiencing higher temperatures? Is this a place we need to intervene and, pursue action? Next slide, please. This is another set of tools we procured. These are thermal heat scanners. So you can use them to scan city surfaces. And you can see here, grassy surface versus light gray pavement versus black asphalt. This is right outside our city office in Kapalama Hale at 4:30 p.m., which is pretty hot time of day. You can see the full 30 degrees difference between the types of landscaping between grassy surface and black asphalt, and then light gray pavement, is more reflective than black asphalt, so it's cooler, but still pretty hot. You're reaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this can also really help, we have control over what we can do with our city environment, with our city surfaces. So how do we plan better to keep our city cool? Next slide, please. The last collection of sensors we procured are these eye button sensors. They're really tiny. The idea is that people can wear them at their hip, can wear them, at their shoes. And you can use these eye button sensors to really measure the pedestrian experience. You can track volunteers for a period of time as they commute to and from work, walk around their neighborhoods, go to the park or go to the beach, play sports, and you're able to really track the ambient temperature around them. The key question here is, where are people facing the most heat exposure in their everyday lives? We already know that at temperatures of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, certain populations are more at risk. Those who engage in physical activity outdoors, so these are like outdoor workers, military personnel, athletes, at a temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, elderly adults and children face elevated risk. So how do we track the temperatures people are experiencing in their everyday lives and their everyday activities, and know how to best advise people on what to do and what not to do when the heat gets very hot outside? Some of this information, we're hoping some of this information will serve to better understand that. Next slide, please. So is this the next slide? It shouldn't be.
It was mostly just to re-emphasize what Ujay's been talking about, right? A lot of this information is telling us the conditions today. And we know that it can already feel as hot as 107 degrees in certain places around this island. That's a combined heat index measuring both temperature and humidity. So better understanding more now with this fine-grained detail, as Ujay just explained, will better inform and continue to build the evidence base to take action. The whole sort of premise and thesis on the creation of the office is that change is coming to us, and inaction is not a choice anymore. Either we can be proactive about addressing climate change adaptation needs while also ensuring that we're not contributing and continuing to contribute locally to global heating and climate change, but how do we start to think about it all around the community for people all around the island?
For that. And, just wanted to echo a lot of what Matt is saying. I think the emphasis really is on implementation, and the first portion of this presentation on, climate ready Oahu and the climate adaptation strategy. We're looking towards how we can guide implementation of plans, programs, actions, and policies. Looking specifically, at cooling and green infrastructure investments, cool roofs and pavement, green roofs, trees, and urban tree canopy. Also looking towards regulations for new and redevelopment. So maximizing cooling strategies when planning for development, is incredibly important. And then also looking at partnership opportunities for community of opening green spaces. Parks and our trees are really our only natural resources in our urban areas. So it's really important to maximize them and take advantage of them when we can. And so collecting this data is critically important to guiding implementation for city departments, right? As they implement city plans for infrastructure and services for all of Oahu's residents. They are the key implementers for the city. For trees, for example, the majority of the responsibility falls on the departments of Parks and Recreation. And so in the interest of adapting to a changing climate, it's really important to know priority locations for cooling to help guide city plantings in high priority neighborhoods. And collecting research also serves as critical evidence for the climate adaptation strategy. It really helps us prioritize and include the right actions to mitigate future climate risks. And I just wanted to, appreciate all of your time today, and just wanted to end my portion on saying that, the goal of the research that we're doing here is always to better guide implementation of plans, programs, actions, and policies. Action is a top priority for the city, and effective implementation of action is key to moving us forward as we, work together with climate adaptation strategy, with everything all together towards a more climate resilient future. Thank you.
And with that, that concludes the information and content that Ujay and I wanted to share with you tonight. Big mahalo to Morgan for sort of live chatting all the links and the resources. But a lot of this already does exist at that main project website, climatereadyoahu.org. So that's probably the best one-stop shop to access some of the tools and resources that Ujay and I shared with you all tonight. But at this point, that a big mahalo to you all for tuning in, and we're happy to take any questions, Gavin.
Okay, so the floor is open. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to, I guess, turn your microphones on or whatnot. I actually have a question for you guys though, first to start it off. So I noticed on your map, you did a lot of portions of the coastline or whatnot. Did that include the west side or the north? Because, those areas can get really hot, too.
Yeah,
well.
So good keying in on that, Gavin. And part of it was influenced by just what was available through this NOAA award that we had been selected for, a small grant through the Climate Program Office. But that weird sort of shape and boundary, even along Kolauloa, all the way around, North Shore and West Side, it actually is a designated land use classification. So the state, we have a statewide land use classification. There are 4 classes. On this island, we only have 3 of them. We have conservation land, agriculture land, and urban land. And it's within the state urban district that the city then has additional breakdown of the kinds of uses and zones. And it could be anything from, heavy industrial, resort, to even preservation. So that very thin strip along Kolauloa or along the west side is actually that state urban boundary, which doesn't capture everybody, but for the most part is where people live.
Okay.
So it doesn't get some of the ag kinds of properties or the farmstead stuff, but it's mostly the neighborhoods and the community.
That's I kind of figured, but I just noticed that, yeah. Anybody else got any questions? I don't know if Alice wants to ask her question. She checked in the chat.
I see it in the chat. So
yeah.
I didn't read the paper. I think there was a midweek piece that I saw floating around, and the data that is being referenced in those should be alarming. It is old. It references a time period between 2010 and 2013, I should say. And we actually are kind of on the precipice of being able to update that information, because NOAA is collecting or has collected LiDAR data for both Maui Nui and Oahu. And ultimately, we'll just need to process that information to get a better sense of a canopy change analysis since the early 2010s.
Good question. Anybody else got any questions? Let's see. Just looking. I don't hear anybody asking any questions. I guess it's 7:22 now. If nobody has any other questions, I'm gonna try to wrap this up so we can end at 7:30.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Gavin.
Yeah,
could I just offer that, for anyone that's interested, the best way to stay informed about this project and the office's work is to sign up at resilientoahu.org, either for our newsletter, our office newsletter that goes out monthly, and then also to follow along with some of the social media so that you can see when meetings are coming up. And that's really the best way to stay tuned.
Morgan put the link in the chat, so if everybody can check that out if you're interested. But yeah, with that, hope you guys all had a great night for the seminar. Hope you guys all can make it for next week's seminar. It's on Thursday, March 11th, same time, 6:30 to 7:30. It's What the Cap, Climate Action to Meet Our Carbon Pollution Elimination Goals, presented by Rocky Mold and Holly Kim. So hopefully you guys can make it for that one. With that, I want to thank Matt and Ujay for interesting presentation. And hope you guys all can tune in for next week's talk. So
yeah, thanks so much for giving us some time and space, and mahalo to you all for tuning in this evening.
So aloha.
Aloha, gang.